Good evening and welcome to everybody. As part of the series Recontextualizing Bismarck, another expert workshop is taking place today, to which I warmly welcome you on behalf of the Ministry of Culture and Media. My name is Verena Westermann and I'm the head of Department of Museums. For those of you who have not been here so far, please allow me a brief retrospective excursus. The recent worldwide debates and protests on how to deal with colonially charged and racist monuments have set a broader debate in motion that has also influenced our discussion on the Hamburg Bismarck monument. The criticism on the ongoing renovation of the monument, formulated, for example, by the Advisory Council for Decolonization and various initiatives last year, highlighted the need for a broader, more diverse and more international public debate around the historical significance of Otto von Bismarck. Once again, it became clear how important and inevitable it is to hear the voices of those affected by the consequences of colonialism. With this series of events, we are meeting both demands, that of an adequate artistic and didactic contextualization and that of participation and multi-perspectivity. So far, we have particularly focused on Bismarck's significance for the history of German and European colonialism. With this series of events, we are meeting, no, I'm sorry, I just go out. This does not mean, however, that we will limit ourselves to colonial perspective in the future evaluation of the person and the monument. The workshop series aims to generate a multi-layered foundation for an artistic and didactic competition, which we would like to announce at the end of this year. And with the workshop of the 12th of June, we have attempted to close a gap in the historical classification and evaluation of Otto von Bismarck as a person, his responsibility for German colonialism, for the division of Africa in the Berlin Conference, and for the ongoing consequences of his policies in the formerly colonized countries. We invited various scholars to discuss the presence of Bismarck and his policies in Cameroon, for example, and Namibia, and to ask which current research results need to be taken into account in the recontextualization of the memorial. And you can find the recording of this event from June in full length on our website, kolonialem Erbe. And today's workshop is dedicated to the question of what makes the monument and its evaluation difficult, and what other artistic or activist interventions from other countries or cities we can take up for our own process. We have invited 5 guests for this evening. Initially 6, but one person canceled at short notice for scheduling reasons. So I would like to extend a very warm and cordial welcome to Dr. Koko Atsamede from the University of Lomé in Togo. Good evening, nice to meet you. Next, we have Alice Proctor, an art historian from London, UK. Hello. I can't see you. Okay, yeah, now I have you. Then we have Noah Ha from the German Center for Integration and Migration Research in Berlin. Hello and good evening. We have Susanna Jorek from the University of Leipzig. Hello. Okay, I see you. And we have Hanni Mariokin, an artist, curator, and activist from Hamburg. Hi. You will find the short biographies of the speakers and furthermore information on the website I mentioned already. So we come from Togo to London, Bristol, and Berlin, and we are approaching the situation in Hamburg today. In the first part, our 5 panelists will present examples of so-called difficult monuments and report on how to deal with them. In the second round, the participations will discuss whether and how they can be transferred to our context. And after the experiences of the last workshop, we have decided to hold today's event purely in English, in order to create as much internationality as possible in view of the later competition. However, we will transcribe the contributions into German for further reading and also post them on the website. If you have any questions or comments, please use the chat function, and you can ask your questions in English or in German, and we will translate if necessary. And if possible, please address the questions directly to the speaker and on the panel. We will not repeat your name of the questioner for reasons of data protection. At this point, I would like to refer again to our code of conduct, which we will post in the chat. And now I have the great pleasure to introduce tonight's moderator, Dr. Linda Irolo. She's a research fellow at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies here in Hamburg. Hi, Linda. Monuments can help us to remember also injustice, violence, and outdated ideals from which we would like to distance ourselves today. This process is not over or finished at some point. And we would like to ask you, the panel participants, and you, the audience, to shape this process of re-evaluation together with us. Thank you for listening, and I give over to Linda.
Thank you, Verena, for the very warm welcome. We want to again welcome our guests joining us from probably several places, just as we see spread out in our panelists as well. Good evening to all of you. Good afternoon, wherever. We're happy to have you on the platform today. We can see that we have a good number of people joining us. We're already like 50 audience members that I can see now joining us. That's great. The first part will begin immediately with no further ado. Like Verena mentioned, today's workshop focuses on what makes the monument and its evaluation difficult, and what other artistic or activist lessons can we draw from other countries or cities for the Hamburg context. So in this first part, I'll leave it to our panelists to present their take or experiences of handling difficult monuments, and they have a maximum of 10 minutes to present their inputs. We will begin now with Dr. Koku Asemede. You have the floor, Doctor.
Thank you very much, Linda. And I want to thank everybody for the invitation, especially. And I'm very impressed in what is going on now in Hamburg about the Bismarck, monuments. So my experience from Togo is not so far, but I'll share with you anyhow the way we are dealing with our monuments here. So today I would like to talk about the monuments of the German-Togolese friendship in Bagida, in Togo. So in 1948, there was the inauguration of two monuments in the context of the centenary of German colonialism in Togo. So the first has been placed in Togoville, the place of origin of the native people who signed the Protectorate Treaty. It also inspired the name of the colony Togo. And the second one has been placed in Bagida. So Bagida was the place of the signature of the Protectorate on the 5th July 1884. And it has become the capital of the colony until 1893. So I would like to talk especially about the Bagida monuments, so which is called the friendship, also the German-Togolese friendship monument. So the monument has been inaugurated, like I say, in 1984 as part of the celebration of the centenary of the German colonial presence in Togo. And it has been built by the eminent sculptor, Paul Ayi. He was a very eminent artist. So the monument is composed of a pedestal on which stand two women one of African appearance with a flat nose, you see it, and the other European with a pointy nose. So behind the couple, there are two pillars that could represent the Goalies and the German communities supporting the two women. So the symbolic of the monument is also important to be presented. I think the choice of the sculpted women is about the representation of the women in the society. The women represent anyhow the cultural identity of the people, as she is also seen as an educator of the family and society. And the meaning of she's also, does represent the meaning of the appeasement of tension, maybe something like tenderness of love. Therefore, the woman is a symbol that represents a symbol of reconciliation, you see. So why the monument is called Friendship Monument? So I made some remarks. The description of the monument is consistent with its name. The name Friendship suggests that the German to Goalies past has been cleared up, thus materialized by the monument, which would symbolize the reconciliation and the friendship between the Togolese and German people. Was it a reality, or was it really? Or did the idea come from the population itself, or from whom? That's what we want to see. So why did we need a monument? In fact, the signing of the Protectorate Treaty on the coast of Bagida between the representative of the king of Togoville and the German consul Nachtigal, representative of the German Empire, was the start of the progressive occupation of the territory from the coast, which was to be called Togoland, then Togo. See, so by following the First World War, in the following of the First World War, the German Empire lost its colony, which was placed under French mandate until 1960, when Togo obtained its political independence. So although the relationship between the Togo, the Francophone Togo, and the former German colonial power has changed, the material and immaterial traces have always brought back memories of this fact. The year 1984 was an opportunity for the Togolese and German authorities to look back at their common history. And that's why the monument has been built at that time. The idea of building the monuments to commemorate this past came from the Togolese authorities, just in order to materialize this common past. Why the name German Togolese friendship exactly? I think the attribution of the name monuments of the German Togolese friendship comes from the following motivations. A part of Togolese is convinced that the Protectorate of July 1884 sealed a friendship between the Togolese and the German people, although the historical facts show normally the contrary. The memory of the German Togolese past in Togo and political issues led the political authorities to give an impulse to the economic cooperation at the expense of the historical aspect of the celebration. The frame and the dates were propitious to sign agreements and to reinforce the relations, especially economic and diplomatic, between Togo and Germany. So the proof of this assertion was that Franz Josef Strauss, the head of the German delegation from Germany, who was in Togo at the time, he was also a friend of the President Erbe at that time. In his speech, he didn't mention memorial events or monuments and the like, but rather the opening of the National Archives, the opening of the Harbor War, financed by the German authorities, and the remission of debts It means, so he mentions only aspects of tangible economic assistance of our cooperation. So I can say that the German sides were not really concerned about the monuments, which has been built, which has been inaugurated at that time. So we just notice that there was at that event an instrumentalization of the German colonial past for economic purposes, especially by the representative of the German delegation. And the event was also at the Togolese side, the high point of the political use of Germanophilia by the Togolese regime, you see. So even by the president Erbe, we noticed the almost caricatural praising of colonialism, of colonialization, you see. So even apart from that, parallel of this event in Lomé, there were many other exhibitions in Germany, especially in München and Bonn. So the impact of the monuments in the Togolese society has 2 points, especially. The monuments of the German-Togolese friendship is very well known in the Togolese environment and has become a place of memory that symbolizes the German colonial past. Also, it has become a touristic attraction that recalls the presence of the German colonial power in Togo. And to conclude, I can say that the monuments of the German-Togolese friendship symbolize the German-Togolese historical reality, but the name that it carries betrays this reality and leads to its instrumentalization. So it belongs to the most representative monuments of the colonial heritage because it refers to the common past of Germany and Togo. But what is to be noticed is that the political discourses around the monuments do not easily allow people to have a critical opinion about this past. That's why I think until now, it is very difficult for a person to go anywhere in the contrary sides away of the political discourse that is now going on. So that's what I can say briefly about this monument of the German-Togolese friendship. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Asemede, for a good use of time. Thank you, that was perfect. Thank you for also bringing in that aspect of monuments in Togo. Now, next up will be our panelist, Ms. Alice Proctor. Alice, please, you have the floor.
Hi, thank you so much. Firstly, I want to say again, thank you for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here and interested in hearing this conversation. I can already see there are some good questions in the chat. I want to firstly lay out the fact that I come at these questions of memorials and memorialization from the perspective of an art historian. So my work is primarily in the context of museums and art galleries. I work with and around monuments, but I'm most interested in the ways that stories are told in institutions of art and art collections, things like that. So I have an experience as an educator and as a tour guide, and that's the primary origin of my work. I've got a couple of images to show you that I think relate to this subject. I ran a project called Uncomfortable Art Tours for 3 years that led unauthorized guided tours around national museums here in London. The main aim of this work was to introduce people to colonial histories that were on display but not necessarily engaged with by audiences coming to these national collections, the National Gallery, the British Museum, these sorts of institutions. And as part of that, these images were created that I'll show you now in order to try and provoke a conversation about the way that we commemorate certain figures and their actions. So firstly, this is an image of Robert Clive. Clive was an officer of the British East India Company and was a huge player in the colonization of South Asia, and was involved in some of the most brutal history of the British in that part of the world. Clive is a figure who, during his own lifetime, was understood to be very controversial, not universally beloved or anything like that, and wasn't commemorated in a kind of public or populist way after his death because of this controversy. The image here is of Clive in his later years as a general. It's very much an image of command and power. And the sort of label attached to him here as murderer is about the fact that he was known as an incredibly brutal military leader and incredibly vicious and aggressive general. So Clive is one of these figures who still has a public monument, still has a statue, even though he was widely disliked in his time. And it's really only much more recently that people have started to try and defend his reputation. And that defense has very much been prompted by movements to criticize him, movements against his statue, movements to reevaluate the history of the British East India Company. Among the other figures that I addressed during my guided tours were much more ambiguous, shall we say, individuals. So these two men are Captain James Cook and Admiral Lord Nelson. So the invader is Captain Cook, which is a reference to the fact that he was one of the first Europeans to visit what is now Australia. And his legacy is very complex as part of that. You know, he's widely celebrated as a hero in his hometown here in England. He is sometimes celebrated as a hero in Australia, but his statues and monuments have been subject of a really significant reevaluation recently. I'll talk more about him in a moment, but I wanted to also show you an image of Nelson. Nelson is by far one of the most popular figures in British history that my tours addressed. He's really up there with a number of the monarchs like Queen Victoria, Elizabeth I, as a sort of untouchable heroic figure of British history. His image here refers to the fact that he was a vocal supporter of the British transatlantic slave trade. And we have personal documents and correspondence saying that he would do anything in his power to prevent the abolitionist movement. He was very much in favor of the status quo in Britain as it was at that time, and maintaining the enslavement and transportation of people from Africa to Britain's colonies in the Caribbean, and the Americas. So his history is far more complex than the kind of heroicism with which he's normally treated. My point here is to show you that there's no such thing as an easy monument. There's no such thing as an easy historical figure. And one of the questions that I've seen come up in preparing for this event is this idea of what do we do with a monument that's difficult? My aim would be to encourage people to realize that all monuments are difficult. All historical figures contain these ambiguities, contain these conflicts and difficulty. And actually, if they weren't difficult, they wouldn't be interesting. When we engage with figures like Captain Cook, like Nelson, like Clive, like Bismarck, what we have to do is understand the way that the individual overlaps with the mythology that often is begun during their lifetime, but really intensifies later on. Which brings me to some actual monuments that I wanted to talk about. So this is a statue of Captain Cook in Sydney. I just want to mention, although I'm based in London, I am an Australian. And so my particular interest is in the way that his identity is created between Britain and Australia. Australia is a settler colony, has a very specific kind of imperial inheritance. But this is one of these examples where we see a figure who has not really come up for much criticism. His statues have not been sort of the focus of reevaluation here in the UK. But in Australia is a much more contested figure, and his legacy is very much up for debate. This was the police response to a protest recently. This statue has frequently been graffitied. The most common slogan that will be spray painted on it is "No pride in genocide," which is a statement that's used often by activists and movements in Australia to recognize the dispossession of Indigenous Australian people. And related to that, we have the figure of Churchill. So this is again an example where we see a kind of popular activist movement to reevaluate these figures being resisted from above, in this case very vocally by members of parliament here in the UK. The Churchill statue was graffitied with Churchill was a racist during Black Lives Matter protests last summer in the wake of the Colston statue coming down in Bristol. And as part of this, and in response to other protests, the statue was then put in a box. I love this photograph because it's such an interesting embodiment of a kind of anti-monument. You know, the statue has to be protected from the people around it. And so it becomes this weird kind of negative space. And I would personally be kind of in favor of leaving the box. The box is gone now, but my interest in these figures is in the way that we can understand that there's no such thing as an easy statue, no such thing as an easy monument. Even figures who, like Clive, might be seen as kind of unquestionably problematic and difficult still have their defenders. Whereas someone like Churchill or Nelson, who are really definitely up there in terms of the most popular figures in British history, also have these kind of darkness and complexity to their histories as well. You can't take one without the other, and you have to understand that as much as people might wish to defend a historical figure for their great works, those works often come with a kind of flip side. I would encourage people to think about the way that we use terms like golden age, and this idea that we have these kind of eras of prosperity and power, and think about the context in which that gold is acquired. You know, where does the power, where does the wealth come from when we talk about these kind of figures? So I don't want to go on too long, but I hope that these will give you something to think about, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you, Ms. Proctor. No such thing as an easy historical figure or monument. That's an interesting take on the issue. Next up, we have Dr. Noah Ha. Dr. Noah Ha, the floor is yours.
Hello, thank you for having me here. I will share my presentation. Okay. So thank you for having me here. I'm speaking here from the German Center for Integration and Migration Research, but actually my background is into studies of race and racism. So actually coming more from disintegration research. And I would call myself a post-colonial urban studies scholar. So I took a bit of freedom. What I want to show you here is not so much a discussion about a specific monument, but more about an educational intervention. So the question here today is also what makes a monument so difficult? And I think it's a quite easy answer. It's race and racism in public space. And just to also share with you what is my understanding of racism, because if we look into German society and in its discussion, there's a broad understanding of what do we consider as racism. And Alice Proctor just said before, it's so uncomfortable because we have on one hand the understanding that racism is just an individual matter of prejudice and just it's about education. But here I brought it's quite a longer definition. It's by Susan Arndt and Nadia Fortay Al-Azhar from 2011. And it's a huge, it's like a lexicon, and its title is How Does Racism Speaks Out of Words, Legacies of Colonialism in the Archive of Knowledge of German Language. And I will try to do a brief translation of the definition here, but it's saying that the whole ideology and the way of thinking was about to invent racism, and in particular to invent the white race, which is putting them as a normative norm in the middle because of Christianity, because of the of power and privileges. So we're talking about long-grown knowledge about what race and racism is about, which we see in ideologies, in ways of thinking, in ways of believing, and also within our ways of speaking. And at the end, it's also saying that racism, and I think also colonialism, is one of the heaviest hypothetical legacies which we have to deal nowadays in our societies. Also three books, and it's also to broaden up a bit the whole discussion. It's not just about a specific monument in one city. I think the conversation we're having here is a larger one, as you said in the introduction, and I brought through three titles which focusing on the question of colonialism, but also race as a category in Europe. One book by Gloria Wecker on white innocence, a book by Fatima El-Tayeb on European others, and then the collection by Gominda Bamra on decolonizing the university, just to give you a little bit of scope. And also, which I think it's important to make a difference between a settler colonial context, which we could look to Australia, but here in Europe, I would make a difference that we're talking about a metropolitan colonial situation, which is affecting a bit our understanding of race and racism. So this is kind of the background. I was teaching at Technical University in the field of historical urbanism, and I came up with a seminar, and the aim was to map Berlin as a post-colonial space. So my question to myself is, when I'm educating in a German university system, what kind of knowledge is needed? So I did approach migrant, diasporic civil society organizations and asked, what is this what you need right now, right here? Because they're having also a lot of difficult conversation, in particular about street names. And they said, we have a huge problem because we have to go from one borough to one borough, and we have to explain over and over again that colonialism is not just part into this one street name or a monument, it's a larger legacy in urban space. So we conceptualized with migrant diasporic civil society organization the whole teaching. And so students came and they were asked to map this Berlin, the city. So you see here now the output which we had, and just to switch to the next slide, because we were categorizing and approaching colonialism through different layers, and also to reflect that colonialism is impacting knowledge production, societies in various ways. So it was about the whole question of enslavement. What is it? What kind of spaces and locations we could identify in Berlin connected to that history? Knowledge production, universities. I mean, universities were teaching colonial clerks who were sent to the colonies. Specifically, the decisions about policy and war. I mean, this is very much also connected to the figure of Bismarck, who invited European nations to the Berlin Conference. The whole questions about economy and trade. I mean, the whole slave trade, it was the very first acting that, I'm not getting the German word, but also I think that is very important for the city of Hamburg as being a port city, having long connections into the world through economy and trade, but also religion. Churches went into missions all over the world, but also the question of remembrance. And the last layer was one which was giving us a lot of headache, because if you look at the first layers, it was very much focusing on the perspectives on the perpetrators, the perspective of the colonizer, but not very much into anti-colonial resistance, what was their perspective, and so on. So it was just one semester we had to deal with this. And so the students were asked to dig into the archive and see what's there. For example, they were looking in this called, in German you say, Völkerschauen, like these exhibitions where people from the colonies were brought, and to ask also the archive, what kind of information you get? Like, do you get the names of the people who were brought to Berlin? Do you get any information, how long they stayed, what they did, and so on? And so the students learned that it was very frustrating that they didn't get all this information. They get only numbers, but through the numbers, the individuals were becoming very upset. So for the students, and that was kind of the overarching question for myself, how could we develop an educational didactic process to bring students into a discomforting situation, but use that discomfort to reflect what kind of knowledge do they know, what kind of new knowledge do they need, and what kind of question. Because at the end of the day, we also have to adjust all our moral implications. What do we consider as right and wrong? And I think the question we've seen in the chat are targeting to the question. And I think that's making it so difficult about the whole Bismarck monument, because we are configuring or figuring out, not only as a city, but also as a larger society, what do we consider as right and wrong? Because I think if we talk about Bismarck in Hamburg, we do also talk about 250 statues and towers, Bismarck towers throughout Germany. So this is the discussion you're having here. It's not just a Hamburg discussion. I think it's a larger, also within a national perspective, about a question of national remembrance and how do we deal, but also how do we teach and educate. So this was my example, which I wanted to share with you here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ha. It's important to make that link between race and colonialism and the fact that the two are not mutually exclusive. Next up, we have Susanna Jorek. Susanna Jorek will be coming in now, and we have a maximum of 10 minutes for your input. The floor is yours.
Yeah, hi, I'm apologizing because I couldn't share the screen myself, but the technical support is sharing the screen. Thank you very much. And also thanks for inviting me to this panel. So I'm gonna talk about the very prominent toppling of the Edward Colston statue in Bristol, because I happened to do my research in Bristol, and it was kind of unfolding when I did my research, and it's a very interesting example of decolonizing public spaces and commemoration. So we probably all heard about it a lot, but I will still give some details of the events or contestations that actually led to the toppling, because it wasn't just a single event, it was actually building up. So I'm just going to briefly talk about that. So last year, we all witnessed the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent Black Lives Matter protests that happened particularly in the Western world, and were not only aimed to express the frustration about the murder of George Floyd and the ongoing mistreatment of Black people and communities in the US, but also pointing towards ongoing discrimination of Black diasporic communities in the home countries and underlying structural reasons. So, and the protest peaked or saw a spike in the debate on the entanglement of structural discrimination and public commemoration, in particular when the Edward Colston statue was toppled in Bristol during the Black Lives Matter protests on the 7th of June 2020. So Colston was probably not very well known for people outside the city, but he was already a very controversial figure in the city. And that was because he was commemorated not only in the statue, but we had, there were other spaces like street named after him, schools, pubs, etc., etc. However, what these public spaces and commemoration sites failed to include was actually that he had gained his wealth from the trafficking of human beings, and they were kind of narrating him as this philanthropist who gave some wealth or some money and contributed to the wealth of the city. So there were two main reasons for the criticism of the statue and the wider public commemoration. Firstly, because it failed to mention his involvement in the trafficking of enslaved Africans. And he's just a few figures. He was responsible for trafficking 84,000 people, including 12,000 children, and 19,000 people died on his ships on the Middle Passage, so the passage from West Africa to the Americas, or in particular the Caribbean. He also, as a Bristol MP, later in his life, he campaigned to keep the slave trade legal and on favorable terms for traders. So it was not just securing his own wealth, but he was also securing that the trade remained profitable for others. And what he was remembered or narrated later was actually that he did give some money to charity, and we have some knowledge. So when he died in 1721, he left £71,000 to charity, which today approximately amounts to over £60 million. But this not only shows his, if you want to call it generosity, but it also shows the enormous wealth that he gained from the trade. The other reason for the criticism of the statue was that when it was put up, over 160 years later in 1985, after his death, it was not a decision that was based on a democratic vote or because he was such an important historical figure, but because there was a small group of local merchants called the merchant venturers who had a clear political agenda behind putting up the statue. And the merchant venturers are a group of traders who were and still are to some extent influential into the politics of the city, and a very secretive group. So they have a lot of throughout the history, they had a lot of wealth, and they influenced politics and had a lot of power in the city. There was one particular member, he was campaigning for putting up the statue. He tried to find sponsors, but eventually he failed. And it is now known that the statue was mainly funded by one single source, an anonymous source, but it's believed to be either the merchant venturers or the one person, John Aerosmith, who was campaigning for the statue. So it's kind of also important to ask the question why the statue was put up by this group. And it's kind of believed that it was to, on the one side, pick up Bristol as a city and glorify the city, but also glorify the role of the traders, of the merchants, of the merchant venturers, in a time of declining empire and also increasing class upheaval. So Bristol and other cities throughout the UK actually saw increasing class struggles, upheaval, etc. So I think this is important to just bear in mind when we talk about why certain statues are in a place, because there's most likely an agenda behind putting up the statue and paying often, huge amounts for a statue. And it kind of contradicts the idea that, as we also sometimes, believe that they are erected kind of naturally because they are part of our history, or it's just important to tell this story, but there's an underlying agenda, and this is often about securing power and power relations, or preventing, changes to societal orders, etc. So as a consequence, statues also serve as perpetuating narratives and kind of naturalizing orders and hierarchies, etc., etc. In Bristol, and this is the next slide, sorry, I don't have many slides, but there has been an ongoing contestation against the statue. It was already throughout the 20th century, but it really got a very wide attention in 1996 during the Festival of the Sea, when the city failed to, it kind of celebrated Bristol's involvement in the Atlantic trade, but it failed to actually tell the story of the transatlantic slave trade. And local artists and activists, often of Caribbean or Afro-Caribbean descent, increasingly publicly criticized the statue. And we see the one image by Tony Forbes, who is who was a local artist, and the picture is actually commissioned by the museum, MSHED, and it kind of shows the artist, you know, still in chains and captured actually by and sold down the river by the statue. And we have other groups like Countering Colston, Bristol Radical History Group, who all have been highly engaged in revealing the story behind the Edward Colston as a figure, but also the transatlantic slave trade. Yeah, so I think it's important to say that the statue was associated with pain and trauma of those who were enslaved or their descendants, who by the mid-20th century or partly lived in the city. But it also showed that monuments and statues perpetuate narratives and strongly influence how we remember the past. Focusing on historical figures often leads to the glorification of their achievements. It often lacks contextualizations or scrutiny. It lacks contextualization of entanglement of wealth and power. It downplays contributions of others, overrides history, etc., etc. And there are other examples in Bristol, but I'm not going to go into them. I just want to, as a closing remark, then want to point out, the next slide, it's the toppling, and we all see the iconic pictures that we, next slide, please, that we all saw in the news. And decolonization is a critical examination of the past and the present, as well as a critical examination of the past in the present. It holds the idea that if we do not carefully scrutinize remnants of the past, we will continue to produce inequalities in the present, and even more so with the same victims, because if we don't change the structures, then we will have the same people who suffer from discrimination, oppression, etc. And when looking at monuments, it's important to ask two questions from, I think, to scrutinize monuments. And these questions are: who set up the statue in the first place, and also why? Because as I mentioned before, there's always an agenda behind putting up a statue, and it gives us an idea of the agenda if we ask the question who set it up and why, but also can contextualize it and see it, look at the time when it was put up, etc. I don't know if I have time to quickly talk about the current. Well, it's just basically the currently the Edward Colston statue is displayed in the museum in MSHED in Bristol, and there is an attempt to create this ongoing conversation with people in the city, and there's there's an online survey, but there's also community engagement to include a lot of different perspectives to understand what should happen next with the statue, but also what should happen with the plinth. And this is, I think, an attempt of democratizing what is being put up in the public space, and maybe this serves as an example for others as well. So yeah, that's my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Jurek. It's an interesting take on how to decolonize public spaces. We'll carry on with that conversation. I can see, just to notify our audience, that I can see the questions on the chat, and that will be addressed in the third section. So we haven't forgotten you, you're still in the conversation. Last but not least, I'd like to bring in Mrs. Jokinen to give her input. The floor is yours.
So thank you very much for this kind invitation, and I really appreciate to be here tonight. In order to look more closely at the leading question tonight, what makes the Bismarck monument so difficult to handle, I would like to start with Hamburg's heritage as a leading European colonial metropolis. So here we find numerous colonial monuments, street names, representations, and colonial infrastructures. In our work group, Hamburg Postkolonial, we research the city space and invite to educational and art projects, exhibitions, city tours, etc. In 2014, Hamburg started a citywide decolonization program. Nevertheless, a kind of colonial aphasia still prevails among decision makers. Unfortunately, even today, new colonial ciphers are being created in urban space. So the city development has churned out several colonial names for new streets and even buildings. Housing projects were started in historicizing architecture styles. At the same time, colonial landmarks have been demolished. Here, an example, the Törl silo for palm oil in Hamburg, Harburg. There has been critique indeed how the city deals with its colonial sites. Among others, there have been no decolonizing concepts either for the for the National Socialistic Colonial Memorial in Hamburg-Jenfeld, or in the Michel Church for the commemorative plaque honoring German soldiers in colonial wars. Despite our efforts, since 10 years now, not a single colonial street has been renamed yet. Currently, the city aims to develop guidelines for future renamings. Meanwhile, the Bismarck monument is being restored for 9 million euros. In the hollow plinth, the National Socialistic symbols will be preserved. That has caused a lot of critique from many sides. Last year, NGOs called for a moratorium, unfortunately without success. For this panel, I was asked to give an example for the fate of a colonial monument. I would like to remind of the Schimmelmann monument affair in Hamburg-Wandsbek. In 2006, the district, together with the Minister for Culture, erected a new bust honoring Heinrich Karl Schimmelmann, a main transatlantic slave trader in the Caribbean and sugar plantation owner in the Danish West Indies. Right from the beginning, the Hamburg-based Black community and civil society initiatives protested against the monument. We artists worked on Schimmelmann's numerous vestiges in urban space. The scandal was reported by the Germany-wide and even international press. After 2 years of protest, the politicians decided to clandestinely remove the bust. Now there is a telling void space that would perfectly be suited to a memorial in commemoration of the African people who were enslaved by Schimmelmann. In Schimmelmann documents, we have found more than 60 of their names and some biographical hints. How can we decolonize Wandsbek? Is it sufficient to remove just one monument when at the same time the surrounding city space is full of Schimmelmann's representations, buildings, and infrastructures? When district decision makers and local history books highlight Schimmelmann as a so-called philanthropist, there we have it again. How do we succeed in changing the four street names that still honor the slave trader, while even the offices of the district government building are proudly decorated with reminiscences of Schimmelmann's Wandsbek Castle? Generally speaking, how can we decolonize piece by piece when further ciphers in public space do praise the colonial narrative? Accordingly, is it possible to deconstruct the huge Bismarck monument when still 2 more Bismarck memorials exist in Hamburg? Where we find the Bismarckstraße, Bismarck statues on building facades, busts honoring Bismarck, as well as Bismarck foundlings, a Bismarck oak, and a Bismarck museum. Indeed, how can we deconstruct the persistent myths of the Bismarck narrative as a whole? And as it was said, there are so many further monuments in Germany for Bismarck. In today's debate, much Eurocentric school knowledge about Bismarck is being reproduced. Bismarck's post-colonial aspects have not yet been much researched in Germany. Meanwhile, some Hamburgers have rushed into counter memorial proposals, but these ideas do not seem to have been appropriate answers to the rather complex historic, ethic, and art theoretical questions. And even though the city of Hamburg spends millions for the restoration, no financial resources have been considered for an educational concept so far. In the hollow plinth space, an exhibition is planned. For this, we definitely need a change of perspectives. That means history shall be narrated with views of the people who became victims of Bismarck pan-Germanic and imperial policy, and of those who fought against it, be it in Altona, Hamburg, Germany, or in Bismarck's European as well as in his colonial wars in Africa and the Pacific. So here my final comment. In our city space, we are surrounded by monuments that depict men with or without horses. They do not meet our today's requirements. Commemoration cultures are always contemporary, and we find iconoclasm, that means toppling monuments, throughout history. Having said this, I agree with Professor David Simon from the first Bismarck workshop that we should not necessarily remove the Bismarck monument. Today, the majority of the citizens of Hamburg do not regard it as an honoring memorial, but rather a historical document. Erasure would lead to historical amnesia. With art and participative works in progress, the monument can be transformed step by step into on its own counter memorial. And beyond all questions of monument preservation, direct art interventions into the memorial itself should be made possible as well. My last point, monuments out of so-called perennial materials are a very Western form of commemoration. In the former colonized countries, memory in many cases is embedded in body performances. In the Danish West Indies, for example, local history events are annually performed by the descendants of the enslaved Africans. In Ghana, West Africa, flags depict past community events. In festivities, dancers move the flags, and with them, local history is collectively commemorated. In my view, the Hamburg Bismarck Monument definitely needs a powerful and an empowering counter image. It should be fluid, process-oriented, performative, and participative. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Jokinen. It's important for us to know that it's not just the Hamburg statue, but the issue is scattered around Germany. And this leads us to our second section, where I have just one question to throw to the panelists before we go into our Q&A. And that question is, based on your experiences and what you're doing so far with monuments, whether and how some of the interventions or lessons, if there are lessons that you can take from your experiences into the Hamburg situation. And I will suggest that we still go in the format of the presentation, and that would be Dr. Asamede first.
Okay, thank you very much, Linda, for giving me the voice. I think, thank you for all the presentations. I really appreciated it. And my impression is that I can notice that people are somehow against racism, that is true, and the symbolic of these racism like monuments, people are trying to topple them. I think, I don't think that's, like, let's take the example of Bismarck. I don't think that Bismarck has only done maybe bad things. Bismarck, in the context, so in that context, was trying something to defend the German nation. But today we notice that he has made many mistakes. I think what we need to do, like Hani said it's perhaps to add information on Bismarck, on the history of Bismarck. so that people know that lack of information about the person is now added. And instead of praising the person, you have to know how to deal of how to handle with also his history. So according to me, from my experience in Togo, what is going on is maybe the problem in Togo, for example, is that people don't have all information about this history. There are many lacks of information about this history because many sources are in Western languages, either in German, in the Südländisch, either in English or in French. And so before knowing the history, you have to have access to those archives, to those things. So that's why in Togo, for example, the debates is not really made in the civil society, but in the circle of academic. So the academic are trying to bring people step by step to know how the history is going on. But on the other side, I think there are some authorities use this history for its own political purposes. That makes also difficult. But I think to say, as for me, that a statue or a monument should be toppled, it will be, if you continue doing it, like somebody asked, we will also destroy our rivers. We will also destroy many things, and then we will regret it later. So I think the better is to understand the history and to add also information that's lacked in the history and to continue.
Thank you, Dr. Asamede. Yeah, so Ms. Proctor?
Hi, so I find this question so interesting, and this idea of sort of what we do with monuments is, to me, just as interesting as, you know, the monuments themselves, like the idea of creating a new life for them. I definitely, I am generally, just sort of as a blanket statement, in favor of any kind of intervention or interaction with monuments like this. I think the examples from around the world of protest movements, of kind of performance-based responses to monuments, the idea of activating these spaces is incredibly important and can provide a process of repossession, I would say, sometimes of these figures. I'm thinking in particular of images recently from Canada and the United States of not only the removal of monuments, but the way that that removal becomes a kind of performative act in itself. The idea of, you know, you see footage, you see images of dance and of celebration as part of the removal of these statues. It's not a simple negative act, it's actually something very creative in many cases. I would say that generally speaking with monuments, my stance is that they should go into a kind of managed decline. I support the idea of letting statues decay, recognizing that these are objects with a kind of natural life cycle. I'm certainly not in favor of, is it 9 million euros of conservation? And I think that speaks to a particularly kind of anxious, small c conservative idea of needing to protect the past and keep everything perfect and as it is. I think that the most interesting thing that we can do with monuments is let them have lives, let them have stages, you know, let them decay, let them break down, not at the risk of public safety, but with a sense of transformation and recognizing that these objects are not fixed, they're not static, they're not naturally occurring. And the responses of communities and of individuals to these statues to transform them, to change them, to destroy them, to move them, is part of their life cycle. And we have to sort of support and facilitate that.
Thank you. Interesting conversation going on here. So Dr. Hart, what do you have to say about the question?
Yeah, that's a good question. What are the lessons? To me, one of the lessons I'm also having in particular with the question about public space is not so much about the particular monument and what happens to the monument, but more about the whole process. So I think if we take the legacies of colonialism as racism seriously, and as we want to take a stance against racism, and if we see how it's enmeshed into our society and culture, I think what the way out is to create a new culture of commemoration. So on one hand, I would also say something about, I think Hani Yokinen said that even today we have all these colonial legacies, but if you look into the investment of Europe in through different European cities, in particular after 1989, after the end of the Cold War, you see a revival of colonial narratives, of colonial monuments, of colonial urban development. I mean, here in Berlin, we have this whole case about the Humboldt Forum, Humboldt-Hafen. So I think there was an active process to activate colonial narratives, the good colonial nostalgic history. So this is on one side. So the question is also how we can activate anti-colonial knowledge production. We'd have been there in the 60s and 70s. I mean, there's also in the public space, and to me it was interesting. I've been working in Dresden, and I was running through the Patrice Lumumba Street in Dresden. So you have also a kind of and it's due to Cold War that socialist states were connecting differently to anti-colonial movements. So I think this is always what we still need to bring into play. So then secondly, I think we have to understand that our understanding of modernity is connected and constituted by colonialism. And this is a very discomforting knowledge, because it puts everything what we know turns around, and it's difficult to navigate through that. And then the third point I want, and my last point, which I would like to make, because I've been part of several discussions in several cities, and there's a lot of time the question of discomfort, how to deal it, and the first reaction is how can we do it right and very fast. And I think this is a moment for urban societies. This is a moment and a process of democratization, and to take that serious, to have a conversation with everybody who's living in the city, and consider also not just to deal with the monument. I mean, Alice Proctor said, give it an alive, but also I think we can also think through what is about to abolish monuments and why do we need monuments and so on, but to really understand the whole process as a process of democratization, because more and more people have a say in what's the future, who do we want to honor in public space, because building up a monument is giving honor to specific people. And so with whom do we want to identify for the future? Is it Bismarck? Or is it female anti-colonial resistance fighters and warriors? I mean, there's a lot on the spectrum we can center around and have a new politics of remembrance, because this is not about the past. We have a lot of histories, but to center new futures which we take as a reference. And that's why I wanted to refer to what happened to 1989, because there was this active process of centering of European colonial history. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ha. Susanna Jurek, yeah, you can comment. What's your response?
Well, I think a few things have already been said by the previous speakers, but I also agree that it should be a more democratized process. So now looking at the Bismarck statue, who actually, again, who paid those 9 million euros, who's responsible for maintaining and running the site, etc. And how can we democratize decisions and decision-making around this? So I think this is a really important aspect, but also again, and this has been said, I mean, unlike I'm very much in favor of toppling statues, and particularly of certain statues, not all of them, but certain statues I find are just so problematic because of the engagement of the people, that I'd rather see them not in the public space. But this is my personal opinion. But I would also like to see more contextualization, more scrutiny, more information, more research on the different aspects of this, of the time, of the person, critical stances, and also what I think is really important is to understand and to listen to the different communities and what their relationships is with those statues in the public space. Because as we've seen with Colson and others, these statues do create trauma with certain communities. And also the toppling or the removal of the statues from public spaces is sometimes creates emotional responses from people who really like the statue or kind of associated with their own individual personal life, etc., and really understanding and creating conversations between the different communities. But I think it's really important and to understand that if you have certain public figures, and Alice Proctor mentioned the US, we've seen the Confederate statues, that these people really, you know, they stand for a time where certain communities and groups were just really oppressed, enslaved. We see with the indigenous people in the US and in Canada, culture taken away, etc., and we do have to realize and understand that this creates trauma even in people who are living today. And I would more like to see an understanding and a willingness to deal with this trauma. And I think we in many ways we don't even know yet how to do that. So yeah, that's my stance.
Thank you. So and finally, Mrs. Jokinen.
Sorry. I think, first of all, we need another kind of research, especially regarding Bismarck's intervention in the colonialism, since the research by now, I have followed it up since 2015. That was the celebration of his date of birth. I think that the normal Bismarck research has been blind for his colonial aspects, and I have found many hints already, and I think there's a lot of potential. And this also goes, of course, for other colonial monuments and street names, etc. I like the term of repossession. And the question is also, what kind of a role plays the Monument Preservation Office, for example, in Hamburg? Is it possible to intervene into this huge monument or not? There have been debates in the BIPOC communities whether to topple monuments or not. There have been different kinds of voices and opinions. And I think we should very individually look at each monument, its history, the history of the person, but also the myth, and even who erected the monument. Like in Bismarck, it is obvious that the monument was erected by Hamburg-based colonial merchants who were the initiators of the monument. Achille Mbembe has proposed that all the colonial monuments in Africa should be collected in a space as a kind of a monuments cemetery. I think for me as an artist, these monuments are images, and we could, in fact, work with them. I have written a concept called Park Postcolonial for Hamburg, because we have the most colonial monuments probably in whole Germany. Many of them are already damaged by their age or by topplings, and we could collect them in a space, so they would not more greet the people, but each other would be rather surrealistic. And we could invite artists from African countries and from the Pacific or other former German colonies to work with those monuments and to change them over and over again. And the idea is that one day they become their own counter monuments. And maybe there would be a chance also that these artists would work with German-based artists together, so that we could start a kind of a healing process with these monuments. That's my input.
Thank you, Mrs. Jokinen. We are doing well with time. The responses have been interesting so far. There are lots of questions on the chat. I will start with the first question that came in right after we started the event. And I think that question can be broken down into two big issues. The person in question, raising this question is talking about some of the scribbles that we find in the Bismarck statue, including the fact that, asking, should we even be celebrating this man? Should we spend this amount of money on renovation? So what I would like to throw to the panelists are two broad questions. So on the one hand, we already know that there is going to be a contextualization, but considering especially what Mrs. Jokinen mentioned, that the amount of money, finances that will go into the recontextualization, as well as how can we deal with this recontextualization and actually bring in all the elements of this controversial figure. So how can we deal with these two big issues? Does it make sense to recontextualize, and how can we recontextualize without spending that much money on the statue? I don't want to mandate, kind of call any panelists, but I will, say, go in and interject if you have a response to this already.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Doctor.
So I think, as far as I know about Bismarck, Bismarck was the person that's, anyway, for the first time, brought German to a certain unity. So Bismarck was the person that's anyhow tried to win many wars for Germany. So as far as I know, Germans will never forget Bismarck anyway. So I don't think that the best way would be to destroy the history of Bismarck. But the best way is to try to understand the history of Bismarck and to correct the parts of the history that has been hidden or something like this. and then to maybe to try to explain to the public the way Bismarck has lived, and the where Bismarck have done mistakes, and then so that we introduce some pedagogical informations about the status. I think one thing I would like to be done is to change somehow the educational curricula. By changing this curricula, I think it will help that people know better history, and then people try to make the distinction on things so that we come to a certain consensus. But trying to destroy the history of Bismarck is like people are trying to destroy all the archives about Bismarck. So I think if you destroy the Bismarck Statute, so it is like you want to destroy also the archives. By destroying the archives about Bismarck, it is like to destroy a big part, important part of the German history. It belongs to the part of the German history. It belongs to the heritage. So we have to assume this heritage and to know how to deal with it. And this one, we could educate people through new curricula so that things could be changed. That's my idea about it.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. And we have Susanna Jurek.
Yeah, I think for me, it seems simple, but it's probably simple and hard difficult at the same time. But it would really be if you spend the money on recontextualizing statues and their narratives, and you include underrepresented communities or communities who were affected by those policies, you kind of not waste the money just on the statue, but you also kind of create opportunities and help to those communities to gain qualifications, etc., etc. So I don't see the money necessarily as wasted. But I think that's an important, also in terms of decolonizing research and everything. I think we have to find new ways of including those communities and working with these communities. And I think creating opportunities to do research, to gain qualifications is a great way of not wasting money, but also uncovering and disclosing histories. Yeah.
Thank you, Susanna Jurek. Yeah, the interesting thing is that it's not just the business statue that is in Germany. There are lots of them, and if you consider the amount of money that goes into the statue, and then every other statue that needs renovation as well, it's lots of millions. So that's why I believe that it's an important question that this person raised. Dr. Ha, what's your take on the issue?
I think one question which we also have to look at, and Susanna Jurek was just pointing into the question about the process with the communities. And I think if we're talking about how should we deal, then we also have to rethink who is the we, what constitutes the we, who are the people who decide the we, and so on. And then also bringing into the picture who is excluded, and so how do we create that we? And I think this is what I said by this is a process of democratization, to bring more people to the table, because thinking of Bismarck could be limited to just the question of Hamburg's citizen. But if we think of Bismarck in a global perspective and its impact on the African continent, I mean, because of his invitation of European nations, the borders which were drawn, which are still there. I mean, there's still like reality on the African continent. So the we could be very big, just to make things more complicated. And to the question of contextualization, I think it's a question of education, but I wouldn't consider decaying or abolishing the monument as an act of destruction. And I wouldn't think that this act of abolishing would be also the same as destructing the archive. I would consider the monument as part of the archive, but do we always see all parts of the archive in the public sphere, in the public space? I think if we think monuments, how could we archive this kind of public knowledge into, I don't know, I mean, there was this idea of the cemetery and so on. I think we have so many creative ways, because actually what I would like to contest, that having a monument of Bismarck in the history is the only way to tell history. I think there's so many ways, and this is this process that we are contesting these histories, and we're finding out, because it's not one way of history, and it's crisscrossing and going global, local, and so on. And so it's a long process, it's a complicated and complex process, and I think it's no easy way to get out. But I think the whole process is very interesting to engage with.
Thank you, Dr. Ha. And as I bring in Dr. Jokinen and Alice Proctor, I just want to also point to you that there's a specific question directed to Mrs. Jokinen and Dr. Ha. And the person asked, how can we get away from formulas such as difficult heritage or dark and bright sides of history, given that there is no bright sides to slavery or two sides to slavery or colonialism? How can we replace this euphemism with something more precise? So over to you, Mrs. Jokinen, and then after that, Alice Proctor.
Okay, bright and dark side is of course a kind of binary constellation. Colonialism was never a binary history. It has all kinds of aspects, and if we take the word heritage, of course, and that is, I think, we have made clear tonight, is that heritage is always a question also, whose heritage? Who is speaking? Who are we, like Noah Ha said? Our city societies are changing, and people who live here start to ask new questions. Even back to Bismarck is, we should regard still more colonial aspects on Bismarck's history than only the Berlin Africa Conference. There were different efforts by him to start to decolonize the Congo and Eastern Africa, and he was involved in the Pacific. He was also involved in evicting Polish Catholics and Polish Jews from their own region, because this was the pan-Germanic idea, and we should connect also to the National Socialistic State and Hitler's plans for Poland. And even in the European wars, take, for example, the German French War and the Commune in Paris, there would be really fruitful connections to explore how Bismarck's politics led, in fact, to destroying the Paris Commune, and also there are very interesting protagonists in gender history. So there are so many aspects. This history is so complex. that we should really research it in another way as it has been done by now.
Thank you, Mrs. Jokinen. And over to you, Alice Proctor.
Yeah, so one thing that I want to bring up when we talk about this idea of community responses to a statue is that, not to fall back into the euphemisms that we've been discussing, but there is often a negative response there as well. It is, I think, worth mentioning that the image I showed of the Churchill statue that had been graffitied during the Black Lives Matter protest last year, there was a counter protest to that event organized by white nationalist and neo-fascist groups that included people attempting to violently attack random pedestrians. It was significantly more violent and more destructive than the original protest, and included people making Nazi salutes. So when we talk about the idea of a community response to a statue, it's important to understand that there is no such thing as a community. There is no kind of universal perspective on these figures. And we can talk about majorities and minorities of cities, but it's important to remember that there will, as society stands at the moment, always be a violent backlash to these sort of more progressive attempts to reevaluate history and to include colonial histories and colonial legacies. I'm sure everyone here has experienced some level of that, you know, individually or through their work. The resistance that people attempting to engage with colonial history face is still very, very significant. And so when we're trying to reevaluate statues and monuments, in some ways, these monuments become sort of false flags and almost distractions for the bigger question and bigger conversation about how we conceptualize nationalism and national identity, and the fact that these are still very potent, very destructive, and often very violent concepts that use monuments and statues as a kind of lightning rod rather than these ideologies originating in the monuments are used by the perpetuators of these ideologies. If we think about the idea of having a kind of community response to any sort of monument, and I know that I'm someone who actually advocates for this kind of reaction, we have to be prepared for the messiness and the pain that that brings. I'd also like to add something on the question of the sort of euphemisms that we use about history. I have a good friend and colleague who actually likes to use the term hidden history because it does imply that someone did the hiding. I dislike that term because it suggests that something is able to be ignored. I find this question of euphemisms really interesting, particularly when we think about the idea of dark history or dark heritage and the sort of value judgments that are implicit in that. And ultimately, my solution is to just try and avoid using these terms as far as possible, even though I do also fall into that habit. So I think that's a really interesting question to think about.
Yeah, thank you, Alice Proctor. I'll give you the floor, Dr. Ha. Let me know if you want to also respond to the question of euphemisms. And just before I give you the floor, I just want to point to another question that we have here on going beyond urban spaces. So this person is asking, you know, would you agree that we must not only focus on urban spaces, and he's talking about mountains, lakes, islands, rivers. It's an interesting question if it's actually a question, but it seems, you know, like it is. So how do we deal with all the spaces? Dr. Ha, and then like any, you know, whoever wants to interject, please do raise your hand now, I'll bring you in.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think the answer I would like to give to the question, if we can be more precise or how we can replace, I think this is, for me, it's not the important question. I think if we do consider that colonialism is still alive and not just part of the past, so then, and if we do consider colonialism as some injustice, So then we have to ask ourselves, how can we do justice? How can we do and think about questions of restitution, of repatriation, and all these hard questions we had all these questions about the Benin bronzes, and what's about the question within the ethnological collections. Europeans have been plundering large parts of the world, and it's still holding the wells. And so we also have to think through how we raise awareness in Europe that there is an injustice which is still at play, and it's not just part of the past. So if we start rethinking that and thinking through who we want to be in Europe and putting ourselves of Europe in a global map, and discussing question of justices, then we start changing names and referring to different processes. So this is the answer I would like to give. And to the other question which was posed, if we should go beyond urban space, I would love to cite Syed Hussain, who's an activist. And he said something about decolonization, and which we, in 2010, we did organize a conference on decolonize city. And so this was very inspiring back then for us. And he said, decolonization is a dramatic reimagining of relationships with land, people, and the state. Much of this requires study. It requires conversation. It is a practice, it is an unlearning. So the question is, yes, we have to go beyond. We have to think about our relation with, as human beings, with the environment. It's not just about the names, it's also about the practices and so on. And I think we can go on for hours, but just to let it here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ha. Susanna, you're right, coming, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I also think that I'm not sure if we really should focus on renaming, every space, but really maybe at the moment focus on the most salient and prominent things, because as Alice Proctor said, it can become messy, and I just wanted, and I think we have to create more awareness for the wider public why this is necessary, and can be done by including the wider public, but also understanding their resentments or whatever. And I just want to say that from my experience, there has been a lot of, also in Bristol museums, there has been a lot of backlash and resentment, but there was also people in some kind of the front line who were kind of dealing with it and not turning away just because of this resentment, but it's kind of part of the process. And I think it's really important to be aware of this and then think about ways of including everyone. But the question about the renaming lakes, I'm really not so much, I don't have that much knowledge about lake names and geography, but this is maybe something we can eventually go. But at the moment, I think it's better to focus on the prominent statues, street names, colonial monuments and museums, and disseminate the critique and the problems that these institutions actually create.
Thank you very much, Susanna Yorick. So I hope we're running out of time, but I would give, there is just one more question, someone asking about having the public have to deal with this whole situation of a public statue when we were not the ones who erected it, and the people in power did this, and now the public is being asked to have to deal with this. But just to bring it back to the most important issue for us in this conversation today is how to deal with the statue. How can we deal with this? And we have some comments on, actually some suggestions by our audience. Someone, also said there isn't a need to, topple them, and present some ideas of putting them behind markers, or putting them in a box like Alice Proctor mentioned. I would like to give all our panelists maximum of a minute to address some of the ideas that we can bring into this recontextualization of the statue. As much as our audience member mentioned, it has now become a public discourse, and we have to engage in it. So what are some of the ideas that you feel should be important factors for consideration in this recontextualization? And I'll also go in the same order with Dr. Asamede first.
Thank you. I think how to deal with public spaces. I think, like we said, there are things we can change. There are things that will be very difficult to change in public space. So how public should deal with those heritages? I think the best things is to maybe to decolonize the minds. By decolonizing the minds, we should find a strategy to decolonize the minds, instead of trying to maybe to decolonize things people are seeing, but things people are not convinced to do. So I think the best way is to see how the human being could deal with the other human being. So how the human being, also how person will be able to decolonize their own mind. From that way, I think things will change itself. Things will be changed without so much difficulty. So exactly. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Asamede. So, it's an important point. Decolonize the minds first, and then we can talk about decolonizing monuments. Go to Alice Proctor.
So firstly, I would say that I agree that education is a huge part of this. I obviously have a perspective on that as an educator. All of my work is focused on the idea of bringing these conversations to public attention. And I think that's fantastic. And everyone has a role to play in that, and everyone has a responsibility to engage with that. I know this might be an unpopular suggestion. I always recommend more research. Follow the money trails that are left behind by these individuals. Look at the organizations that are benefiting from or sponsoring the restorations of certain statues. Look at the land ownership, even within cities. These are spaces that present themselves as public, but may well be privately owned. Find out who is making the decisions about where this money goes. If it's politicians, act on a local level and on a national level to engage with that and to change that and transform it as much as you possibly can. I would say that there is a huge amount of information that we can find if we know how to look for it, thinking about things like land ownership, possession, the sort of executive decisions about monuments and statues and things like that, and understanding the connections between sort of commercial histories, colonial histories, and often the people that we see on trustee boards or governorships today. There's a very tangible connection between the colonial histories that we're engaging with and the sort of modern financial landscape of the world that we're in. So sometimes the answer is to do more research and to follow those kind of trails of money and power and inheritance. And you will be surprised how often the same names pop up and the same sort of organizations and individuals pop up. And that can be a really effective way of finding something that you can actually put your energy into and focus on and find a kind of channel for your activism in that sense. But I wanted to point out that I do love the phrase of sort of an urban palimpsest that someone said in the comments, and that is also just really great. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you. So research. Dr. Huff, over to you.
I totally second what has been said before, that actually first we have to start decolonize the minds, and then from there start the conversation and what should be done. So this is also very difficult to say what should be done, because I don't want to patronize a specific discussion how it should go. But I have to admit, I'm an educated landscape architect, and so looking at the monument, I also have an idea what could be. So I just take the chance and share my idea. First of all, I think it's a massive monument. It's really massive. So why not to hide it and have it in a huge, massive wooden box? And you could go around with a stair and make it accessible to people, that they have the view. Because I think if you're standing on the head of Bismarck, you have a great view. And so you could use the hall and have it as an educative space where you can use the wall and give information about the person and so on. And so you have a different accessibility, because it's a huge landmark. And I was looking at it and I was like, I would love to be there on the top and have a view. So why not to put that into some kind of installment? And if it's out of wood, it will cost some money, but I don't think it would be that expensive to the whole restoration and so on. So, but I think there are many, many ideas, and being creative of how to do and hide it. And perhaps in 20 years, you might be gone, the Bismarck monument as such, but in ways of accessing the monument and accessing history and making it part of the whole process, I think that would be wonderful.
I also think it would be a great view from the top. That's a brilliant idea. Yeah, so over to you, Susanna Jurek.
Sorry, can you ask the question again? Because I'm kind of I lost track.
Yeah, so our question is, how can we, what ideas can we bring into the recontextualization? So one point that you think is very important to be considered in the recontextualization of the statue.
Well, as I said before, for me, it's really including the question of, who is the we, who does the research, who does the education, and really including activist groups or members of minorities, because they bring, very different perspectives onto the table, and kind of by just including them and being open to their perspectives and also maybe ways of doing things, is actually already decolonizing it's already starting the process of decolonizing. So just for example, if you have a person who has a disability and he or they probably have a different perspective on, just a room and accessibility than someone who might not have this disability, might not even see. So, and the same goes for members of ethnic minorities and other underrepresented groups, but also be open that they might have different ways of approaching issues and dealing with issues. And then one last example is, for example, in the museum, it's very often perceived as a very quiet space where, you've been shushed all the time and you can't speak. And some communities and they may want to, loudly celebrate or something. So really open up those spaces and allow new things to come in.
Thank you, Susanna Jurek. The importance of the we. Finally, but not the least, Mrs. Yokinen.
The Bismarck monument stood there a long time, full with graffiti, and nobody talked about it. It was there, but since the city decided, or the German state decided to clean it, and also the critiques about the preservation of the National Socialistic graffiti inside the plinth, the debate started. So in fact, the process of cleaning it, making it more statical, and the National Socialistic symbols inside have been discussed only since then. Yes, we should unlearn. We should unlearn. I'm not so quite convinced about the idea that the unlearning or the decolonizing of the minds should or can come first, because I think they go into each other. When we stand in front of the Bismarck monument, we, as the group Hamburg Postkolonial, we talk about this monument. So I don't think it's first this and then this, but all it comes together. We definitely need more research on Bismarck's history, because there are so many blind spaces still in the research until now. And yes, education anyway. Unlearning is a very important term, because there are so many very hard myths around these monuments, and the understanding is really very Eurocentric till now, and very male. This monument is very male, so we should also regard gender history. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Jokinen. And it's also pointing on the last point on Mill that 4 of the panelists are women. That's amazing. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to you for making time to join us, and the inputs. I'm sure it will be very helpful for further conversations and reflections. I would like to bring in Verena now for some closing remarks.
Yes, thank you, Linda, and thank you all of you. It was really a wonderful discussion, and I think we understood in which dimensions we have to go further in our debates. So many interesting points on learning gender history, the huge dimensions of the monument. We should take more into consideration also the NS ornaments, and a lot of things I've learned this evening. Thank you so much for that. And as a tiny outlook for the future for those who are interested, on the 16th of September, the 3rd workshop will take place regarding the question how an artistic intervention might look like. We will invite very interesting artists, and we will therefore also artists and activists, and we will look at different backgrounds for the ideas and the opinions. And I will announce that on the 16th and 17th of September, the Hamburg State Archive will carry out a symposium on colonially charged street names in a digital format also. So the invitation will follow, and have a nice evening, and thank you for being our guests.
Thank you. Thank you from me to all our panelists and the audience. The conversation will continue. The event is recorded, so you can access it on the website. Thank you for staying with us. Good evening, good night, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, Linda.
Bye. Thank you.